Welcome to Journey of an Aesthete podcast. We have a very special guest today, Michel Behrent, who, in my humble opinion, is one of the leading scholars, experts, historians on Michel Foucault. And I wanted to do it. I reached out to you, remember, originally, because I wanted somebody to represent, as it were, Foucault's ideas, thought, biography. And I want to pick somebody who I thought would be the best exponent or what's the word? Not so much exponent, but, kind of a scholar, communicate who this man was. And the reason for this is that I'm a fan. I've been reading Foucault, as you said, we're the same, we're exact same age. We're both 55. We both went to college in the same years, and we came up very influenced by people like Michel Foucault. But I personally have been kind of disappointed at the way Foucault has been misrepresented in the media, distorted, unfairly challenged. I mean, for example, I'm right now finishing up reading all the late Foucault, 1979, 1980, 81. His writings on antiquity, on Christianity are phenomenal. I mean, the people that are dissing Foucault clearly have not read these texts or know about this side of him. Just to name one example, he was a very erudite, learned scholar. Putting aside whatever differences we may have from him, or whatever criticisms we might have of him, at least acknowledge that. But instead, in the media, as I've said, we get this caricature of kind of a villain or kind of a late, they label him postmodernist, that they all sorts of things. And so I thought it'd be wonderful to have someone, yourself, who's finishing actually a book coming out on the early Foucault, right? It's in 6 months, correct? You're the author of this volume, editor here on neoliberalism, which we could talk about because some of the criticism of Foucault is from the left, who I think is probably, would it be fair to say, is kind of skeptical of his skepticism about socialism, right? And the fact he hung out with Gary Becker, he had Gary Becker, communicating with people that were capitalists. We could talk about all that, but long and the short of it is, welcome to the podcast. We could talk about, your biography, how you came to be so knowledgeable on Foucault, and that story, if you want to start there, if that's yeah.
I'm happy to. And in all fairness, I imagine that is the least interesting part of it. But since you asked, I'll say a few words about that. As you and I were talking about earlier, I do think that there is a generational aspect to this. If I'm interested in Foucault, it has something to do with being an American born in the late 60s, right. Generation X, right. Who went to college in the 1980s, but who also, by the twists and turns of his own biography, has a close connection to France. The story of how I got involved or interested in Foucault is banal, but it does have some generational resonance. It so happens that I grew up in France. My parents, or my dad, worked there, so I lived in France in the late 70s and 1980s. I went to sort of a more or less French school, and then I went to college in the United States beginning in 1986. Mm-hmm. I went to Brown University, which is significant, I think. When I showed up at Brown in 1986, there was a whole conversation about French thinkers and French philosophers going on in campus.
Absolutely.
None of whom I'd heard about growing up and going to high school in France. And probably the most important names were Foucault and Jacques Derrida. But there were a number of other thinkers who got thrown into the mix: Claude Lévi-Strauss, Jacques Lacan, Louis Althusser, Roland Barthes.
I mentioned Baudrillard. Would that be?
Absolutely, Baudrillard would definitely.
Especially, to spend a little minute on him. I think the work at that time that teachers were teaching was probably, of course, simulations, I'm sure, but also because it's so accessible. America, if you remember his essay, right. America. And of course, that's a different era than the whole Gulf War did not happen thing of about 10 years later.
Yeah, only barely though, because that's 91. So
that's 91. hold that thought, because I had a question came to mind when you were talking about your biography. Was it the fact that we're both 55? Was it basically that was the milieu in the humanities departments at that time in 86 through 94, and that certain things were of interest to teachers and they happened to be involved, people like Foucault or Derrida? Is it a function of, as you say, generation or times, or is it something, or, is it just, I don't know what you thought about that. Maybe it's a distance.
Short answer, yes. I think it's exactly that. There was a real sort of French theory vibe on in humanities departments at least some American campuses in the 1980s. And one day when someone writes the cultural history of the United States in the 1980s, at the same time that they talk about the movies of David Lynch and various kinds of American punk music at the time, and of course, Reagan and politics and all that, they'll throw this in as well. Probably someone has already written that, and I'm not aware of it. I'll mention in passing that there's a very interesting and I think well done novel by a very good American novelist named Jeffrey Eugenides, who wrote this book called The Marriage Plot, which was actually set in Brown in the early 80s, a few years before I was there, and is almost a kind of roman à clef, that references, popular professors and their sort of popular discussions of deconstruction and how those kind of fit into, the sort of romantic and sexual lives of college students at that time. It's a very, very nicely done and thoughtful book about that period. It's kind of a period piece about the early 1980s in American higher education. So I do think that is part of it. And if just a quick comment on the biographical aspect, I happened to take a seminar with a professor who was just teaching on a temporary basis at Brown, whose name is Jim Miller, and who at that time was writing a major biography of Foucault. Yes,
there you go, James Miller's.
That's it.
Hold that thought.
The Passion of Michel Foucault, and I did a little bit of research assistant work for him, and that's how I got into Foucault. And I guess just what I would say is that, long story short is, I later went to graduate school starting in 1996, and I actually somehow thought myself as quite opposed to French theory for some reason, and gravitated towards the history of political thought. I did a dissertation on the place of religion in 19th century French political thought. And what happened was, while I was in France in the early 2000s doing research, I read an article in Le Monde, the newspaper of record, about someone that I knew about actually from working with Jim Miller, whose name was François Ewald. And he is one of Foucault's. He was one of Foucault's students. He played an important role in the publication of Foucault's works. He actually began a doctoral thesis under Foucault's supervision. Right. And the interesting story was that this guy, and he'd also been involved in Foucault's radical Maoist politics in the early 1970s. And the interesting story was that in the early 2000s, he had become essentially a professor of insurance at a kind of French business school, and became a major figure, sort of intellectual figure in a French employers organization that was sort of launching a significant attack against the socialist government's attempt to reduce the work week. I'm probably butchering some of that, but that is the basic idea. And I thought, wow, this is interesting that a character that was closely associated with Foucault and who really kind of hitched his intellectual star to Foucault has gone in this direction. And again, as you can see, when I say long story short, I don't really mean it, but that is sort of what got me back to thinking about Foucault. And it really became this kind of project where, from Foucault students, I went back to Foucault. I started thinking about Foucault's politics in the 1970s, and in some kind of almost Citizen Kane-like quest, I wanted to sort of find, what the deep original truth of Foucault was, and that has led me to back to his early work.
Well, that's fantastic. I had a couple questions. So James Miller, if you remember, his biography was controversial and hated in certain quarters, certainly in left-wing quarters, right? People on the left thought it was an anti-Foucault biography or was scandalous. And of course, you assisted you were assistant, right, of him. So you were,
a little bit.
And that's a book I've always thought was a really good book, and I always thought it was a little bit unfairly disparaged, because after all, I mean, the respect of Miller for Foucault is all throughout that biography, but it's also a very candid biography, and it's but I don't want to get too much into that particular book. I was just wondering how much of the reception of that book was also a misreading in a way, right? Like sort of that, in much the same way that many people on the left didn't take seriously enough Foucault's anti-state communism, anti-gulag, his interest in Solzhenitsyn and his critique of the left, which is really important, I think, for Foucault, discussion of power. In a similar way, I think people kind of wanted a certain kind of biography. Didier? Well, the more arable biography, which is more acceptable, or more, I don't know, but it's interesting, right? What you thoughts about that, because it's kind of and then you yourself said initially, hold that thought. So you yourself, was your skepticism about French thought because as an historian, your tradition was more empirical and more Anglo-American? Would that be fair to say, or is that, or not? Because there is that that tension between those two different, or is it something else? Is that you?
Probably it wasn't quite as thought out of that, and it was a little bit more emotional and impetuous, kind of a reaction against what I had seen as a kind of academic orthodoxy. So there probably was some need to push back against that. I also do think I was very interested in French thinkers who were interested in exploring France's liberal and democratic political traditions. And there's a series of thinkers that you and I have spoken about: Marcel Gauchet, Pierre Rosanvallon, Claude Lefort, who were doing this. And I think that there was something that I found very compelling about their analysis of French history that led me to kind of follow their lead and looking back at, for complicated reasons, the role that religion played in 19th century left-wing thought. And I suppose that part of the reason that I ultimately found a way back to Foucault was when I realized that there at least were some ways in which Foucault's concerns were maybe slightly less alien to that tradition of thought than I had initially thought. So that became sort of a path back for Foucault, seeing that he is in fact a serious political thinker, and not just a French theorist. People would challenge me for suggesting that there is a dichotomy between those, but I think that in the way that it played out in American academic culture in the 80s and 90s, there was a little bit of that distinction, and the fact that I was able to overcome that, I think, helped me.
Well, I think that you had yourself a kind of a journey there, a story. But again, what comes to my mind is that those thinkers like Ferry, right, and Gauchet's in there too, right, and Luc Ferry and Blandine Kriegel, who worked in the Gulf. She worked under was she in the what administration did she work in? You told me she was.
She I think had an office in the Élysée under President Jacques Chirac.
Jacques Chirac, which of course
the long and unremarkable years of President Jacques Chirac. Yes,
right. But it's interesting that a philosopher like Jacques Lane under Mitterrand, of course, is it's often common to have intellectuals in France work in governments or cabinets. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I think all along Foucault was critical of totalitarianism. And I think there's been a confusion, because I think although Foucault never says I am a liberal, I don't think, he's also not anti-liberal. And so in that sense, I think that's the through line, that Foucault was always was a critic of state socialism and one of the early readers of Solzhenitsyn and the gulags and all that. Surely that's a role. And maybe there's just a confusion in that the left in America in the 80s and 90s, where I would put is that they were not critical enough of Stalinism, perhaps, or they were too hostile to liberalism, maybe. And so that creates a lot. I know I've talked too long, probably. I'm sorry.
No, those are very interesting thoughts. I mean, so the question of Foucault's relationship to liberalism and neoliberalism is quite complicated. These are things that I've written about, and were kind of a series of articles that got me back into thinking about Foucault. The short version, I would say, of what my current position is, which is maybe slightly different from the essays, what I wrote in the essays that I published about this, is I think the phrase that I use in one essay is that Foucault offered a kind of strategic endorsement of neoliberalism. I wouldn't exactly backpedal that, but the key thing is that he almost backs into a kind of liberal position of sorts.
Right.
He finds himself allied with people who are offering something kind of like liberal critiques of totalitarianism and Marxism in the early 70s, even if frequently they do not use that term. Right. And I think it is very significant and important that Foucault never identifies as a liberal. And I do think that is significant. Like, we shouldn't say that he's a kind of closet liberal. I think Foucault was fairly outspoken about his positions. And if he wanted to be identified as a liberal, he would have. But it is so there's this complexity where, on the one hand, he has positions that sort of seem like they are a strong family resemblance to a liberalism of a certain kind. I mean, I take your point, but when I say he's not anti-liberal, I also don't mean that he's pro-liberal. I mean, what I mean is that I think Foucault, had he lived, had we been blessed to have him longer on the planet, and he not passed when he did, I think would have moved. I think he would have moved in a political direction very similar to sort of Tony Blair / Clinton, maybe, possibly. I'm not saying that would have been the right thing to do or wrong thing to do. I don't run a partisan podcast, but that kind of middle way, sort of, that he had certain tendencies in that direction, rather than, as he's written against revolution. I mean, Foucault's writing, especially, he's skeptical of the damage revolution can do, and so there's that too. And so I can see, So I think one thing that you have to bring into the picture, of course, is his most important books, which are books like Madness and Civilization, which deals with the history of, well, among other things, the history of insane asylums, The Birth of the Clinic, which deals with hospitals and medicine. Of course, Discipline and Punish, which is about prisons, and especially the first volume of The History of Sexuality, which is not just about sexuality, but also about, I would say, to a significant degree, the discourse of sexual liberation in the West. And I think it is absolutely crucial to understand that those books were often seen as, and I think with good reason, I think that Foucault intended them as attempts to call attention to the element of constraint, both at the level of knowledge and both in terms, as well as in terms of power relations, in many Western institutions that seem to be non or apolitical, and and especially by the early 1970s, he sees the implication of those books as a way of expanding the discourse of political contestation to realms that had not previously been seen as political, very much kind of along the lines of what we might commonly associate with the kind of late 60s, early 70s attitude of the personal is the political, or everything is political. And insofar as he does that, I think it is important to see that he is seen as providing a kind of fairly robust criticism of Western liberalism, post-war Western liberalism self-understanding of itself. And so I do think that whatever we want to say about Foucault and neoliberalism, that we have to make sure that we keep that criticism of at least certain aspects of Western liberalism background. Now, it's crucial that if you actually look at the narrative of any of those books, they almost all end sort of in the late 18th or early 19th century, so they don't really extend to the present. But I think they were intended as ways to kind of rethink the place of those institutions in society. And the fact that he gets involved in a group that is specifically critical of the French prison system in the early 70s is crucial. I would say that it's in a sense, that what's interesting is that it's precisely because he sees certain neoliberals in the United States, and to a lesser, and maybe to some extent in other countries as well, as offering similar critiques of those types of institutions, that he is able to sort of see this kind of interesting affinity between his project and neoliberalism. So that's what's crucial, is understanding that it's precisely it's not so much Foucault becoming less radical in embracing neoliberalism. It's almost Foucault sort of reaching out to the neoliberals and seeing them as similarly radical to himself. I think that is sort of the nature.
I mean, what I would add to that is I sort of feel like also the context. I think Foucault is responding to revelations about the existing regimes of the Soviet Union. And of course, I mentioned Solzhenitsyn, and that was in the air. And I think too often younger folks who did not live during the Cold War, I think Foucault was actually very sensitive to that news. And I think it connects to Foucault's overall project of being critical of power in general, right? When you're saying, so there's,
I think that's right. And just a few comments on that. So, a crucial part of the argument that I put forth in the articles that I've written about this is that his critique of socialism, his embrace of neoliberalism, and again, embrace of neoliberalism,
in quotes.
In quotes or something like that, right? I don't want to exaggerate it, but as well as his involvement in the whole French debate about Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago in the early 70s.
Also to solidarity, wasn't he?
And at a later point to his support for the Polish trade union movement, Solidarity. That's right. Yes. But I think that all of that has to be understood as a quite specific internal debate to the French left.
Interesting.
And I would, if I could just plug a book of a colleague that I think very highly of, Michael Scott Christopherson is really the intellectual historian whose his book, I believe, is called The Anti-Totalitarian Moment. And it's a very good book, and it was very influential to me in talking about this. And his argument, in a sense, is that the Solzhenitsyn debate itself is really quite parochial, that it's really a bunch of French intellectuals who are very unnerved by the prospect that an electoral coalition between the newly reconstituted French Socialist Party under François Mitterrand, in alliance with a still very Stalinist French Communist Party, could win elections in first in 78 and then later 81. And they basically, I mean, I'm again sort of exaggerating in making this point, but Michael's argument is that there is an attempt to sort of resist this prospect by using Solzhenitsyn as a kind of critique of French communists that has sort of quite sort of narrow and immediate French concerns. And in a nutshell, I do think that Foucault is involved with that, and I also think that that what he is consciously doing in his, and if you read the lectures in which he talks about neoliberalism, I think it becomes quite clear that what he is trying to do is to sort of use neoliberal critiques as a way of highlighting a kind of non-statist French socialism or non-statist French left that is associated with this movement in France called the Second Left, which
Left, right?
is
Michel.
the labor union. That's right. That's right. So in other words, I think.
Well, I think again, I think this is another example of confusion, maybe in the States about, I think people are reactionary. They're assuming, oh, Foucault is a right winger. No, I mean, I think Foucault was struggling with all the news coming out about Eastern Europe and Poland and their presidents. I think he's struggling to find another way, find another path that's actually not capitalist, actually, if I may put it that way, and also not state existing socialism, some other alternative, right? I think he was grappling. Maybe a lot of people are grappling. Also, I think he felt very oppressed by the old French Communist Party and its
totally.
And it's conformism, and rightly so, because
this cracks me up, because you'll still speak to people who say Foucault was a communist, and technically this is true. He comes to Paris in after the war to study and eventually to be a student at the prestigious École Normale Supérieure. He and he says, of course I was a communist, and what sort of thinking person was not a communist in?
Well, everybody went.
Well, that's right, and he mentions his outrage at sort of French involvement in Indochina, and so it's almost. I mean, again, this, I'm sure people would disagree with me, but it would almost be like, are you really going to oppose civil rights, in the United States and in the 50s or early 60s? I mean, there's a similar kind of gravitation, I think, towards the Communist Party. It's not quite that simple, but the way Foucault talks about it, it has a bit of that ring to it. So yes, he is briefly in the Communist Party, but again, I think what little evidence we have about that suggests that that he was not heavily involved. He wasn't that enthusiastic about selling newspapers or going to the cell meetings at the École. And he eventually leaves. And he talks about actually having, I think, on his sort of initial trips to the United States, having faced some difficulties because he had once been in the Communist Party. And what's sort of hilarious about this is that people think that that the problem, is that someone might think that the problem with Foucault was that he was a communist. Foucault doesn't like communism because he sees it as this very conservative political movement, right, and instead embraces, ultimately, if we're, I mean, again, I'm exaggerating, but if we want to sort of try and characterize his position, it's a certain kind of political Nietzscheanism. And if you want to complain about what you don't like, my suggestion is don't blame him for being a communist, blame him for being a radical Nietzschean. I mean, that's
what that is. Did you want to talk?
Communism for him, he saw as almost a kind of conservative movement. So
and that way he's actually quoting Abbie Hoffman on Firing Line. Remember the Abbie Hoffman interview, William F. Buckley Jr. and Abbie Hoffman says, "I don't like the Communist Party; they're conservative." A direct quote. So there you go. Yeah. And that sets Abbie Hoffman and Foucault, even though they dress very differently from each other at that time, we're alike on that. But in any event, did you mind talking about some of the concepts and words that people misunderstand about Foucault, because he developed his own language, episteme, discourse. The word power itself is misunderstood because he does something different with that. Being a subject, which for him is partly pejorative, right? People think being a subject is positive. There's often a tendency among, people that aren't familiar with this stuff to think, oh, what could be wrong with being a subject? But yet, so talk a little bit, if let's say we have a Foucault 101 language, the language of
Well, what I would say in terms of Foucault 101, and this will be fairly conservative, is that I do think it's important to see that there are three main stages in his thought. There's significant overlap between them, and it's a little bit artificial to say that there's just three, but I do think that that interpretation basically holds. And I'm not getting into to what my current research is about, which in a sense is about the very earliest stages of Foucault's thought. But there's an initial stage that is associated with a methodology that he calls archaeology, and that really is focused on a history of knowledge. The distinct way in which Foucault does this is, first of all, by showing that knowledge works in fundamentally different ways and following certain fundamentally different presuppositions at different historical times. And secondly, he interestingly always does it not in terms of some sort of vague history of philosophy, but by examining the way knowledge is practiced in specific institutions. So he looks at sort of knowledge of madness that ultimately culminates with psychological knowledge in his first major book, Madness and Civilization. It's key that it's not a history of psychology, because psychology is only refers to sort of the modern form of knowledge pertaining to madness.
Hold that thought. So what you're saying. So this is the thing that I want to add a little bit to that, if I may, because I think that might help it be clearer to an audience. So Foucault isn't using knowledge. So I think in this stage of Foucault, he's trying to discuss how human beings have been labeled or categorized or constructed, right? And how that could be oppressive in a certain sense, or then at least in this stage, is that fair? Is that too crude a summary or something like that? Yeah.
So I would say that at some level, yes, he is definitely doing that. Let me make a comment about that, and then also suggest another way of thinking about what he's doing. I would say, and again, people always call attention, just or like to sort of say that this, or especially critics like to say that this is this is some kind of troubling and radical critique, because it assumes that knowledge changes in different time periods.
I see the question of whether there is truth, right?
Something like that. But what I would just say about that, if I can, because I think this is important, is that again, on the one hand, that's true. Like, I'm not proposing some sort of radical revision of Foucault. I think the way that people usually understand Foucault has some truth to it. But I would say this, I am convinced that at some basic level, he does see himself as expanding on the basic views of a canonical Western philosopher, namely Immanuel Kant. In Kant's critique of pure reason, Kant shows that for knowledge to even exist, there are certain presuppositions that he calls transcendentals need to be in place. That Kant's hypothesis is that we don't experience space, we don't experience time, we don't experience certain key concepts like unity and multiplicity, that those are already sort of factored in or sort of hardwired in. That's not the right term philosophically, but it makes the point, before any experience is possible. And I think that what Foucault is trying to do is to show that, is to sort of take that insight that for knowledge to exist, certain presuppositions have to be in place, but he's historicizing it. He's showing that it exists at different time periods.
Well, I think that's where people get confused, because I think they have trouble holding these two thoughts at the same time and thinking they're a logical contradiction, which they are not. Namely, that there's something there. There is a truth there. That's Kant. That's a Kantian dimension in Foucault. But also that truth has its own history. And it's partial, which is the Nietzsche, which is what's, I think, partially Nietzschean in Foucault. And I think sometimes folks have trouble holding these together, and they forget one. They look at only one part of Foucault, and then he becomes a relativist or immoral, whatever. If they forget the Kant in Foucault, and then they can do the reverse. They try to, as you say, misrepresent him as kind of an old stodgy Kantian, which he isn't, clearly. But it's is that kind of a way to put it, or is there?
Yeah, I think that's right. And he's not an old stodgy Kantian, but maybe he's a kind of refreshingly original and exciting Kantian or something like that.
I see.
I mean, and again, I actually look. in some sort of general sense, Foucault is a relativist. I mean, he's not a logical positivist. He's not a Platonist or something like that. But I just think we have to kind of understand what that means, and the Kantian dimension means that it is crucial to understand how, or to recognize the fact that at any given historical epoch, there is a sort of structure to knowledge and certain rules that govern how knowledge works and functions. And these are not that relative. They may be relative in relation to something else or to previous times or later times, but that they're, Foucault does sort of try and show that these structures are there. If I can just circle back for a moment to the point about Madness and Civilization. So I definitely think that that's right. He's what you said earlier, that he's talking about how certain forms of knowledge and this, it's not identical, but this is closely related to what he will later call the notion of discourse too, do kind of, construct certain activities or behaviors or individuals in a way that can be oppressive for them. And I think that is a reasonable way of understanding what Foucault is doing. I think there's another dimension, though, to Madness and Civilization, which I guess, I also find very fascinating, which he's very, very explicit in some of the passages in that book, which is from 1961.
An amazing book. I should say for the audience, if you're going to read Foucault, that's one of the, Madness and Civilization is one of the top. I mean,
I guess it's my personal favorite.
Well, it's your personal, but I would include The Order of Things, but that may be too difficult.
That's right. That's right. And that's from 1966, and that's and those are both seen as part of this kind of archaeological phase. But what you have in Madness and Civilization that you don't have to the same degree and really in any other Foucault book, although there are some ways in which it returns in the final works, is this argument that he is talking about experience. And I think this is very, very interesting and fascinating. He says that he describes his book as an attempt to tell the history of the Western experience of madness. Yeah. And that I think is very important because it does suggest in a way that that certain understandings of Foucault have a hard time making sense of. Well, they do. He is talking about that there is a there. That there's he is.
But moreover, notice his language, very Foucault. He's not talking about the history of madness. He's talking about the history of the experience of madness.
That's right.
And that's
right.
That's the phenomenologist in Foucault, I think. So
I think so.
Yeah, there's some real Ponty in there, but go ahead. I don't know what you think.
No. You're totally right, and we know that one of the important intellectual experiences that he had as a student and so on was his engagement not just with existentialism, but with the related, although not to be conflated, philosophy called phenomenology of the time. So he reads Husserl, the great German phenomenologist. He attends the lectures of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the major French phenomenologist. So I think you are literally right in saying that is where that language comes from. Yeah. But I do think that there's this, and again, I know that I'm going to be criticized for saying this, but that there is a kind of normativity that creeps into his thought, meaning a sort of value choice that creeps into his thought when he talks about this, because it is very difficult for me not to read that book, even though there's all kinds of people who will say that you should not read it that way, as a certain, as bemoaning the loss of a more authentic experience of madness. I mean, Foucault's books often kind of consist of three historical moments. There's usually a medieval Renaissance moment, an early modern moment, and then a modern moment. Right. And that book opens with this very remarkable chapter on the Ship of Fools, in which his sort of key argument is that that madness at the time is sort of seen as kind of the presence both of the demonic, but also more generally of the basic problem of human mortality and human finitude in a Christian world in this life. And so he has this kind of argument that, on the one hand, yeah, I mean, are they mean to the mad? Yeah, they put them on these ship of fools. They mock them. But his point is that they are theologically significant. That they are. There's a phrase that he uses sometimes where he talks about them being sort of something like spatially excluded, but spiritually integrated into the society.
Spiritually integrated, right? Well, that's the kind of that's
fascinating. And the story is how we lose that. The story of the book is
how that gets lost.
Yes.
And again, there's another example of how the public at large, media, especially now, they don't talk about that. They leave that out. I haven't read it, and you're missing. So there's actually ethics in Foucault. He's actually saying that there's a tragedy if you lose certain things, and that's a.
I mean, I am going to cautiously say that is my view, and I know that many people disagree, but at least in that book, I think that you see something like that, and I would suggest that there's something significant in there for understanding Foucault.
So then,
by the way, I would also say that incidentally, just to go back to something we said earlier, that there's all you mentioned all the controversy that Jim Miller's book caused, and that's correct. But one of the things I like about that book, in addition to my own sort of personal connection to it, is, and what I think is the reason why I still think it's an important book, is that it's not only a well-done biography that has a lot of important information in it, but it's also this very interesting interpretation of Foucault's thought. I think that's what people tend to forget, which is this argument that Foucault, both in his personal life and in his thought, has this kind of lifelong interest in what he calls limit experiences, of which madness is one. And I think it's crucial that the word experience is in there. Well,
that gets into him taking LSD later in the 70s, right? In Death Valley or Zabriskie Point or wherever he goes. But But did you want to go on to stage 2 then? That's
yes, absolutely. So
what happens to him, or what is it?
So to me, I would actually argue that the big event in Foucault's thought in the course of its development is, to put it somewhat sort of crudely, is his discovery of power. This takes place in the late 60s, early 70s, and is most closely associated with his book Discipline and Punish, which comes out in 1975, which is his history of prisons, and it also sort of flows into the first volume of the history of sexuality, and he develops a whole new method at this point that's called genealogy, which he uses to distinguish his analyses of power from his analyses of knowledge, even if, of course, he thinks that there is some continuity between the two. But here's the issue: is that I actually think this is probably one of the things that is most important for current Foucault reception. I think that when we talk about Foucault today, we think about him as the philosopher of power more than the philosopher of knowledge, even if the two are hard to separate. And also sort of what happened once he took that turn is that there was this kind of reinterpretation of Foucault's earlier work, which he totally encouraged, which encouraged us to see his books about madness and asylums, and his book about hospitals and so on, as books about power. But I would suggest that power is not present in those books, at least in any sort of particularly original way. The focus there really is on knowledge and the role that it plays in the development of those institutions. What Foucault says about power is really quite original in the early 1970s.
Hold that thought. Of course, the most famous quote, which I'm sure you know, it comes from everywhere, right? What is this famous quote? Power is everywhere, comes from everywhere. That's a unique. That was a revolutionary thing in philosophy, I think. I mean, I don't think people had
I think so, and I think it's difficult to understand.
Let's talk about it. It is difficult to understand. Yeah.
So I definitely think that, and I'm just being utterly conventional in saying this, that Nietzsche is his main reference point here. Okay. The term genealogy, of course, refers to the genealogy of Nietzsche's genealogy of morals. Right. But the sort of the insight that Foucault has about power, yes, is that it's everywhere. But I think there's some other points that he makes about power that help us understand what he might mean by that. Yeah. First of all, the key idea is that power is fundamentally relational for him. Mm-hmm. And what he means by that is several things. First of all, he says power is not something that is possessed. The way that I explain it to my students is, like we have this kind of idea that is, is very much sort of hardwired into how we think about politics, for example, that someone holds power, that when the American president takes an oath, he goes from not having power to having power, and Foucault does not believe that captures the nature of power. Foucault's argument is that it is inconceivable to think about power outside the context of a relationship. The metaphor that I would give is kind of like what you have in a tug of war, or maybe in certain forms of certain martial arts like judo or something like that, or wrestling. That it always it doesn't make sense to say that a wrestler
has or doesn't
has power when they're by themselves, right? It's only in relation to someone else and to the kind of the attempt to sort of pin someone down or to resist their effort to pin them down. So it only exists in relationships, and it's almost kind of a meaningless metaphysical claim to say, according to Foucault, that someone simply has power. Right. He thinks this is a kind of unfortunate legacy of certain kind of legalistic prejudices that he thinks really don't understand what power is. So that is a crucial point. So it's almost a kind of, to use a fancy term, it's almost, to say that power is relational is almost a tautology for Foucault. In other words, Foucault would suggest that just as power only exists in relationships, all relationships are necessarily forms of power as well, and again, make of that what you will, but that is his claim. I'll also just sort of notice that there's if you actually, I've never actually done this, but I've kind of noticed it. If you do a close analysis of Foucault's use of the term power in the 70s, he actually you'll see that he starts specifically not using the term power, le pouvoir, in French, and talks about relation de pouvoir, power relations, because he's afraid that we will sort of think about power as this kind of entity, this thing,
right?
I always kind of,
that's important, because he wants people to see that it's not something that's there or not there, but it's
correct.
It's always in relationship. There's always people. It's interesting. It's almost, I would say that's a touchy-feely. This is my own interpretation. It's almost a touchy-feely.
Well,
touchy-feely kind of feminist side to Foucault, that we're always in relationship. And it's important to understand too that for Foucault, he's not using power in only a pejorative sense.
That's right.
It also has to do with having capacities.
But I think, in relation to that touchy-feely aspect,
I'm sorry,
again, no, that's funny. I like it. I don't know. I'm tempted to say, it depends what you want to touch and feel, but well,
I just think that there's that side to Foucault but that's that scholars will take out. But
but it's difficult, because at the same time he's saying that all relationships are power, right? That it right. is, and I think that is fairly subversive, and probably not. It's not just subversive. I think that it's countercultural. Even in relationship to kind of, radical subcultures today, because I don't know. I have the impression that most people still would like to think that that relationships are ways of living that can occur outside of everything that we might not like about power relationships. Whereas if we take Foucault seriously, he's saying something quite different. Now he's not saying that. His point, on the contrary, of course, is not only is he not saying that that's bad, but he's saying that the real issue has to always be, what kind of power do we want? What kind of power relations do we want to be in? But as you said, a major implication of this point about power being relational, and I don't want to suggest that he always I always call this there's these kind of power sermons that you find in his book from this time period, in the opening chapter of Discipline and Punish, and then there's a chapter in the history of sexuality that deals with this, and there's this kind of litany of characteristics of power that he always gives. The relational aspect is only one of them, so I don't necessarily want to prioritize that, but I do think that perhaps that's the most important. But it has other consequences. First of all, that's really what he means by saying that power is everywhere. Insofar as we are constantly engaged in relationships, power is going to be found in all of them. It does mean that he also thinks that so the one sort of take on this is that Foucault kind of embraces a sort of totalitarianism himself by sort of, I talk to all these people who say, Foucault's depressing because he tells us power is everywhere. But he also says that power, I mean, this to me is the touchy-feely part to Foucault, actually.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, go ahead.
Is the idea that power is always reversible, at least in principle. I mean, it's almost axiomatic for him. If you think about the sort of metaphor of power as kind of wrestling or a tug of war, I mean, it may be that in actual practice, the person that you're up against is just bigger than you and stronger than you, and you can't do anything about it. But I think that Foucault is trying to say that it is always at least kind of conceptually possible in any kind of power relationship to imagine how it would be reversed. I don't know if I gained 100 pounds more than my wrestling opponent, then
so that bigger, stronger opponent might die on you or get tired.
Yeah, something like that.
It could be something as simple as that. And that
no, I mean, I think that's actually fairly accurate, right?
Yeah.
Or they'll wear out. They'll need to have a meal or something like that. I mean, I'm kidding, but something like that, right? I mean, the key thing the point being to understand that the power effects stem from the relational aspect, the relational dimension, not from the fact that it is a possession. And then we do need to sort of mention the fact that probably Foucault's most famous claim, although I maybe slightly think that this gets a little bit more emphasis than it justified, is that knowledge is always involved in power as well. And I think that certainly is important, but I really think this kind of relational and reversible dimension of power is his most kind of original claim. And incidentally, this is a major part of his criticism of certain forms of Marxism, because he says this, that he thinks that Marx, that a kind of mistake that at least certain Marxists have made is that they continue to embrace a kind of liberal conception of the state as this sovereign institution in society that possesses power, whereas everybody else does not possess power, or at least only has power insofar as they get a bit of it from the state, and that therefore the goal of revolutionary activity has to be to try to overthrow the state, which is kind of the font of power. I mean, there's a famous line in the history of sexuality where Foucault says, we have yet to cut off the king's head in political. And his point is that we think in terms of the state too often, and
Interesting.
and whereas the real sort of focus should be on sort of challenging the power relations that we wish to function in different ways. I'll just sort of mention that leads to kind of the left critique of Foucault, which says that he essentially kind of abandons the idea of revolution and becomes sort of complacent in a certain way vis-a-vis the modern state.
Right. Well, that depends on what that left wants what they propose as an alternative. I mean, again, I don't know. That's a difficult. I want to get to stage 3, but
sure.
But
well, and I'll just mention that, and again, there's always kind of there's never a sort of complete rupture between these different stages, and Foucault has I think, sort of interesting and probably admirable kind of tendency to sort of always think how his earlier stages kind of prefigure the next stage at which he will arrive. But the final stage is one that is really focused on the history of subjectivity and selfhood, and where it's a little bit complicated in terms of Foucault's bibliography is that it actually occurs between the first and second volume of the History of Sexuality. So the first volume of the History of Sexuality, which is published in France, in English it's just called the History of Sexuality and Introduction. In French, it has the very Nietzschean title, La volonté de savoir, the will to knowledge. But it's this kind of methodological introduction, or introduction, including a methodological introduction to the issue of how to do a history of sexuality from the standpoint of power. But then he decides, and then he publishes that in 1976, and then he decides that for various kind of complicated reasons that what really needs to be understood is the sort of the development of ideas of subjectivity and selfhood, that these are kind of the crucial way in which we have to understand the development of sexuality. So he methodologically makes that the sort of center point of his analysis, although he is very clear that issues of knowledge and power are also relevant to that. And chronologically, he abandons his usual historical schema, from the Middle Ages to the 19th century, and goes back to antiquity. So
that's the stage I've just recently finished studying for this past year or 2 years, because I've been reading all the late Foucault, which I find fascinating, because he writes on Augustine, and he writes on Gregory of Nyssa and the history of cynics, and I wonder, as I read, I wonder, well, are people that are kind of think that Foucault was a charlatan, which he's called by some very intelligent scholars, do they just not know this exists, or do they not? Do they think or do they just think it's irrelevant compared to the damage he had done? Or I don't understand what.
Well, some people think that this is the evidence of him being a charlatan. I mean, there are some prominent scholars who see Foucault's foray into talking about antiquity as very amateurish. The great American philosopher Martha Nussbaum came out, published in 1984.
I remember that.
Shortly after these books came out, the first 2 volumes came out. Sorry, volumes 2 and 3 of the History of Sexuality came out. Wrote quite critical review for the New York Times. In which she just says that she doesn't think he does a very good job. And so
well, that's to be fair, that's her field of she studies Hellenistic.
Sure. I
mean she's right, and she could just be, again, what I would say about that, having read Nussbaum, is that that's her bias. I think she has an analytic Anglo-American bias, and I think that that's really what's reading those books. If I put it that way, gently, you know what I mean? That she's that I chalk that up to the continent Anglo-American war, which I think at that time, especially, you think it's
No, I think that is certainly true. I guess the issue is, I mean, if I can put it this way, I'm tempted to say that it's that that sort of criticizing Foucault's take on classical antiquity would be a little bit like criticizing Jean-Jacques Rousseau's take on prehistory or something like that. When he talks about the state of nature, right?
We're in a climate now where that's what people are doing. Where a scholar like we're in a time, as you know, of popularized empiricism, or sort of Steven Pinker's and Noval and Homo Sapiens, and all these popular nonfiction books have come out that have exactly this kind of attitude. Is like, well, all the stuff that was written, it was all junk because they don't have the fossil records, and we have the fossil records. Right. That idea of what is the truth of the matter. Again, Martha Nussbaum is always going to be asking, I think, what is the truth of the matter? And I think she's going to neglect other kinds of questions, which I think are equally important to what is the truth of the matter. Namely, is how is truth represented by the literature of an era? What is the history of that truth? And moreover, who, including Martha Nussbaum herself, gets to decide what truth is taught, right? So that's kind of my little, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be.
No, absolutely.
I'm Martha Nussbaum. I'm just saying that I see that in my own sort of naive outsider way as really a clash of two different worldviews or different ways of approaching these questions.
I think that's right. And I guess my point about comparing Foucault to Rousseau,
right.
And I'm sure that there will be Foucault defenders who won't like this way of putting it, but is that, so in a nutshell, what is Rousseau doing in his 18th century political philosophy? I mean, he's offering a kind of criticism of the corrupt state of current society and kind of imagining a state of nature that is both different and that holds out some idea of principles that can serve to criticize the present. And in a certain kind of way, I do think that is the agenda of Foucault's early volumes of the history of sexuality. I'm not trying to say that he made it up or simply kind of used that that time period to serve his own agenda, but I do think that is what attracted him to studying those periods. So in a nutshell, what is the content of those books? I mean, I do think that the claims of those books are, again, I don't know if I agree with them, but I do think that they are powerful statements. I mean, so briefly, what does Foucault do in the first volume of History of Sexuality, and how does this later work relate to it? I mean, the surprising claim that Foucault makes in the first volume of History of Sexuality, again, when he's primarily concerned about power, is to basically say, in 1976, so, really kind of in the midst of what is still kind of, the sexual revolution, or at least, the final days of it, and maybe the moment when it starts to become sour, but also maybe sort of extend a little bit more beyond just radicals as well. But what he's trying to say is, and this relates directly to his claims about power, is that we should not that we should not think that the main issue relating to the relationship between power and sexuality in the West is simply that sexuality has been repressed. Okay. He says, I'm not saying that sexuality wasn't repressed, but that that we have to see that there's something more interesting to say about the history of sexuality in Western societies than that, once upon a time it was free, then it was repressed, and then Freud came along, and then the sexual revolution, and we finally liberated sexuality. His point is that the sort of key nexus between power and sexuality in the West has been the imperative of talking about sex. And that, in a sense, that you can sort of see that
what becomes oppressive might be a lack of repression. Or now this is what's so interesting, because scholars today with whom I disagree very strongly, particularly I should admittedly in some new feminisms, probably like this aspect of Foucault. There's kind of the attack on the sexual revolution itself by certain feminist scholars, and they probably would be very fond of Foucault's critique of what was going on then and say, see, Foucault. But I don't know, but it's a difficult question because, of course, well, I don't know. It's I mean, that raises the question of what was the sexual revolution is, and it assumes that that's a stable category. That's my one problem, which I don't think it was. I think that's something that's constructed, after the fact. And I think the safest thing to say about that is it had bad aspects, good aspects, liberatory aspects, oppressive aspects. It was a big thing, and I don't, but I think the fact that Foucault was thinking critically about it was what's important. I've said too much. Go ahead. But.
Well, no, and what I think is kind of striking about the claim is saying that, if you look at, and again, anything that I'm saying here attributing to Foucault could be, is subject to criticism, so I'm not saying that he necessarily gets this right, but his claim is that what's weird about the West and Western society is that we talk so damn much about sex. Okay. And
that's right.
And sometimes the discourse about sex is about wagging the finger and saying, you've got to sort of not be sexual. You've got to behave in a particular way. There's certain standards of normality and so on. Yeah. Sometimes talking about sex is let it all hang out, talk openly about your fantasies, express your desires. But his point, if I can just say this, his point is to not make the dividing line repression or non-repression, but to see the continuity in this imperative of talking about sexuality. And that ties to his view, even if the point about talking is not quite identical to this, but ties to his kind of this sort of interest, which I do think is very Nietzschean in Foucault, that goes deep into his work, and including in its earlier stages, this question about also, which is very much Nietzsche's concern, why is the West, and I do think he uses categories like that, so invested in knowledge? Why do we, the famous line from I think Aristotle's Metaphysics, man is by man by his nature seeks to know. I think is something that Nietzsche wanted to criticize, and I think Foucault wants to make us think about that, and that is the specific stakes of his critique of sexuality. I think is why do we see sexuality as something that is fundamentally tied to knowledge, to self-knowledge? It doesn't have to be, and not everybody sees it in those terms.
Right. It doesn't have to be, and Foucault imagines. Well, that's why I guess, as we've discussed outside of this episode, so many different political stripes. As I said, conservative feminists or feminists who were opposed to the sexual revolution, as opposed to second wave feminists of the 60s, 70s, and 80s that were for the sexual revolution, and why even Republicans in the U.S. or even right wingers and as you said, I think I was surprised that even some Marxists don't want to claim Foucault, which is hard to believe, but. I guess what I'm saying is that the reason why so many disparate people find something of value in Foucault maybe was that he was so autonomous an individual thinker. That he was kind of unique, or wouldn't you say?
I think that's right. I do think, I'm for all that I've thought about Foucault, I'm still sort of personally, I suppose, a little bit ambivalent about him. There's things that I like and things that I don't like.
Right, same here.
But I do, I do ultimately sort of decide on the side of thinking that he's for want of a better term, a great philosopher, whatever that means. And I do think that there is something very sort of original and insightful about his thinking, and that does have as a consequence that he is interpreted in all these different ways and controversial in all these ways. And I would also say that something, and I think this is kind of obvious, but it's worth saying, is that he's is that he certainly is primarily a philosopher. He's not a, political or social commentator primarily, but he also was someone who had a lot to say about contemporary issues, so I do think that's another reason why he is someone that we can't, we seem to sort of struggle to get away from intellectually, whoever we is, because there's, even, what are we going on, 40 years after going on 40 years after his death, he is still seen as a thinker who's very relevant. He doesn't feel especially dated.
No, he's very, very relevant. Did you want to talk a little bit about your experiences in France, or more about James Miller, or
whatever you want? I'm happy to.
We're getting towards the end, not the end, because I just wanted you, I guess, to say what inspired you, or so the experience of, you grew up in France, so that's right. So I guess for you, coming to the States might have been a shock, but I don't know. And you teach at Appalachian State University now, right?
Correct.
So when you're thinking about your journey to now, what comes into your mind? You're working with James Miller, a very interesting scholar who was, I think, unfairly disparaged. You wrote a great book. I agree. When you put all this together in your mind, what do you think, or what do you hope to do in your new book, or what do you hope this will, when this comes out, right, in 6 months or half a year, what do you see? What story do you see happening there with that, all that?
Well, I hope that the book is original, but I also think that its goals are quite modest, and I am totally comfortable with that. Which is that at the end of the day, the point is that Foucault is a significant contemporary thinker, and I would like to simply, first of all, try to situate him more historically, and second of all, I think reach a perhaps richer understanding of the philosophical nature of his project, particularly by focusing on his early thought in his early years. Not because I want to tell people that their interpretations of Foucault are wrong. First of all, I don't think that's true, and second of all, I don't, think I'm in a position to do that. And why would I want to do that? But I do think that there is a way that we can have a kind of richer understanding of sort of where his thought came from, and I think that could potentially be interesting to some people. So that's the idea. And I guess I would, in terms of the book that so that's called Becoming Foucault: The Poitiers Years, with Penn Press, and I think it's due out in December or something like that of 2023. But the goal is to really kind of, I suppose, provincialize Foucault in a certain kind of way, or to sort of tease out the kind of provincial, in a way, dimension of his thought by examining his childhood and the experiences that formed his childhood, on the one hand, and then also seeing the way in which those experiences impact and are at times referenced in Foucault's thought. And I'll just mention that the next project that I'm working on is one that really sort of is an attempt to kind of reconstruct Foucault's thought in the 1940s and 1950s, which I think both is kind of a distinct phase of his thought. We only know there's manuscripts and there's small articles and things like that he's published, but I think they actually are both a distinct phase of his thought, and they shine light at least on certain aspects of his later thought.
I mean, that's why I'm so excited to read that book when it comes out, for that reason. And I think you and I can agree that Foucault is a creature of the 40s and 50s, that he's not. Another misunderstanding could be that a lot of his audiences were more boomers or people of the 60s and 70s. And maybe some of the misunderstanding is the deep roots he had in World War II, and the generation he was. And that, I guess, I'm sure your book will get into, you can't overlook that. That's right. I
think that's right. And I would also be tempted to say that when you start to situate Foucault, he's born in 1926, so when
Yeah,
you start to situate him in that period, you also see that the 19th century, which of course is one of the obsessions of his thought, is also not very far behind, so there's, so that's an aspect to it. And I think that's right. I mean, he kind of becomes a sort of philosopher of the boomers, even though, and I think wanted to be. I think he was quite happy about that. But there is a way in which his thought is rooted in an earlier time. Both intellectually, in terms of what his intellectual influences are, and in terms of the the experiences. I mean, again, this is one of the things I try and take up in the book, but it is worth thinking about the fact that the great 20th century philosopher of power, does live for 4 years under direct German occupation.
Yep. That's not a coincidence, right? Not accidental to his thought. I really want to thank you for your generosity and time and your addition. This has been an enjoyable episode. We're going to have you back, of course, as you know, in
Excellent.
the future when I do my book launch on, what is the French title? Disenchantment of Marcel Gauchet.
Marcel Gauchet's book, it's the same, it's the literal translation of Disenchantment of the World. It's Le Désenchantement du Monde. And then the subtitle is Une histoire politique de la religion, a political history of religion. And I'll just mention, that what's sort of striking about that book is he references the phrase that I believe comes from Max Weber, the disenchantment of the world. But I don't believe that he ever uses that phrase in the entire book.
Not one.
Yeah.
Is that a publisher's thing? Was that the publishers, or that? I'm wondering, because
it might be. I don't remember on that.
But I look forward to that, because that's an underrated book, and as you said, I hold it up so high. I think it's more important than Karen Armstrong or Lane Pagels in terms of study of religion. But that's in the future. But thank you, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, Michael.
Okay, thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.